Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Logan, your WebEx producer, and I'll be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. We do have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you experience technical difficulties, please send a message to the WebEx producer using the Q&A panel. You may also dial 1-866-779-3239 and receive technical support assistance. During the presentation, all participants will remain in a listen-only mode. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded for rebroadcast. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send, and then please keep the drop-down as all panelists. We also do have a couple files for your convenience. If you should be able to see a file transfer box onto your guys' screen. If you want to download the resources, go ahead and download those. And I'll just leave this up for about 10 seconds so everybody can download that. If you don't have it, don't worry. This will be available for you guys after the presentation also. And then the recording of the webinar will be available online a few days following the presentation. And then with that, I'd like to introduce your first speaker for today, James Butler. He's the Family Assistance's Program Specialist. James, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Trauma-Informed TANF Programs, Moving from Awareness to Transformation. I am James Butler, as has been said, and I serve as one of the program specialists here in the Office of Family Assistance, and I work under the leadership of Lisa Washington Thomas. We're sponsoring today's event through our PeerTA network. The goal of PeerTA is to provide responsive, evidence-informed peer learning and TA by linking TANF agencies and their partners who serve TANF and low-income families at the state, county, local, and tribal levels. Today's webinar will highlight a PeerTA request OFA received from the Vermont Department of Children and Families, who requested assistance in their endeavors to ensure their TANF policies and practices are trauma-informed. So we are very pleased to have three very knowledgeable presenters who will be discussing trauma-informed care and Vermonts Journey as they work through their policies and practices. Our first presenter, Mandy Davis, serves as the Executive Director of Trauma-Informed Oregon. Mandy is a licensed clinical social worker and is also an Associate Professor of Practice at Portland State University, where she teaches and lectures on implementing trauma-informed care and trauma-specific practice and services. Nicole Dubuque serves as the program manager for Vermont's Reach Up program. Nicole led the efforts in developing the Trauma-Informed Evaluative Tool for Vermont Reach Up through PeerTA. Andrea Hetling is employed at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Dr. Hetling has been working in the field of domestic violence and trauma, specifically related to TANF, for many years. She has an extensive background contributing to research and policy related to the family violence option under PERORA. What I'd like to do now is turn the floor over to Mary Roberto, who serves as the project director for our PeerTA network from Manhattan Strategy Group. Mary?
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. As James said, my name is Mary Roberto, and I'm the project director for PeerTA, and I'm so excited for this event today. The PeerTA team has been working with Vermont Reach Up for over a year to develop and implement a trauma-informed evaluative toolkit. So now they're able to kind of work with staff and assess their agency in key areas to ensure that their policies and practices are more trauma-informed. And as Logan said earlier, should be a link, if you don't have it now, to that toolkit, as well as some resources and the PowerPoint presentation. If you can't get to those right now, they will be sent with the recording a few days after this webinar. So Vermont's journey with OFA PeerTA began with a request for assistance in evaluating their policies and procedures to ensure that they were more trauma-informed. But Vermont's trauma-informed journey started long before that request, as the state recognized in the early 2000s the need for all the agencies of human services to work from the same policy guidance related to trauma-informed systems of care. And Nicole Dubuque will be talking a little bit about that journey in a few minutes, which is it's just extraordinary what they've done all across their programs. We're honored to share this journey with you today, and the hope that some of the principles will resonate and will help you along in your own trauma-informed journey. Our objectives are on the screen over the course of the time today. We hope to really keep you engaged. I know a lot of you are one webinar after another, one Zoom meeting after another, and we do know that some fatigue sets in from there. So hopefully we'll keep you engaged, and we'd love to have your questions. There were a number of questions that were submitted along with the registrations that we'll go through towards the end of the session today, and you are more than welcome to continue to send those questions to us, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So we'll really try to help you understand the key concepts of trauma, resilience, and trauma-informed care. But in the TANF context, there's tons of materials out there, and Andrea will go into some of that. But this was really designed for TANF. Understand how to develop resilience in TANF programming, become familiar with the toolkit itself, how it can be used. There are several different actual tools that are in that toolkit, and you can kind of mix and match and see if any resonate for you and you'd like to use them in your programs. Identify like I said, which tools will work for you. Maybe some won't, but there's also some information, as we said, with related to resources available to state, tribal, and local TANF programs in a resource document that I mentioned earlier. So again, please give us as many questions as you feel comfortable and want to give us, and we'll get those answered even if it isn't today. And as Logan mentioned, we'll provide an audio transcript of today's webinar and slides with those documents. So I'm going to go ahead and move into our first poll question with you all. Logan, if you'd move to the poll, here's the amazing presenters. We want to know a little bit more about your knowledge, level of knowledge about trauma-informed care. Can you let us know whether you feel like you're a novice, you're trying, but you don't get all of the concepts yet, or maybe some of the language is really unfamiliar. You feel like you're an apprentice, almost have it, but I could use more information and practice. That you're a master, you get it, and you're right where you think you're supposed to be, or you're an expert, could teach it and apply it in new and creative ways. So go ahead and choose just one of those, and we'll go ahead and give you the summary of that here in about 30 seconds. So go ahead and let us know where you're at. Logan, I'm not sure if everybody's having an issue choosing. Can you check on that? There we go. I see the outcomes, and it looks like about 30% right now feel like they're in a novice, about 49% about apprentice, 14% feel like they're a master, and about 4% could teach it, so like they're an expert. So that's really helpful for our presenters to kind of direct, the level of knowledge that they want to give to you today. So I appreciate everybody's participation in that poll. And I'm going to go ahead without further ado and transition over to Mandy Davis, who is the director of Trauma-Informed Oregon through Portland State University. And yeah, thank you, Mandy, so much. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Excellent, thank you. Can we advance the next slide, please? All right, so hi, everybody. I am thankful that you're here today to hear about applying trauma-informed care specifically to TANF programs. I have a passion about this connection being made. So my name is Mandy Davis. I am the director of this thing called Trauma-Informed Oregon. We are housed at Portland State University, and we are funded mostly by our state health authority, so the Oregon Health Authority. And we're here at the School of Social Work. And our job actually is to help organizations and systems apply the principles of trauma-informed care. My role today, which I'm excited to be here, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview, and it's great that with a novice and apprentice, I think this will be helpful. A little bit of overview of trauma-informed care, and then I'm really here to facilitate in a conversation about the evaluative toolkit, as well as the work in Vermont. And this is the part I'm excited about, so you can actually hear and listen and ask questions about how this work actually gets applied, so we can start moving from awareness into transformation. I'm excited to share this space with you today, this virtual space. I'm sad I can't see your faces. Trauma-informed care is a relational model, and it's not easy to do it virtually. So I'm also going to strive, or ask we all strive, to do this actually in a trauma-informed way. So I'm just going to ask you to take a moment and check your space, right? Do you feel like is there anything you need to do to adjust your space so you can stay as engaged as possible? Are there lots of distractions or any of those things you can take care of in a certain way? Do you feel physically and emotionally safe in your space? I'm a big advocate of fidget toys. I have a few in my hands. So I think if you can access your fidget toys, if you have pencil or paper to write down questions or words can help you stay engaged when there's a lot going on around you. Stay hydrated. Snacks are great as long as your mic is off. That's important too. Please do engage yourself also by asking questions. And again, we'll either be able to answer them in the time or we'll find a way to get that answer to you later. I also really encourage you for screen fatigue to at least every 20 minutes, look somewhere that's not your screen, 20 feet off in the distance for at least 20 seconds, and then you can bring yourself back. This is not a slide-heavy presentation. It's really more about a conversation, so I hope that's also going to limit some of the screen fatigue we are all experiencing. All right, so I'm going to jump in and talk about kind of what this thing called trauma-informed care is, and the way that we talk about it, you're going to do your own work on how to make that work for you. All right, so what is trauma-informed care? So trauma-informed care is defined by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, SAMHSA, so trauma-informed care is when a program, organization, or system, and I always want to stop for a moment and just let you hear that, a program, organization, or system. It does not say an individual, family, or group. So everything about what we're talking about today is going to be about organizational work, system work, and organizational change. So trauma-informed care is when an organization, program, or system does these kind of 4 R's. So number 1, realizes the widespread impact of trauma and adversity and the multiple paths of recovery. And this last part's really important to me because there's no one way, right? So that we're going to honor in our programs, we need multiple paths of recovery. The second thing an organization is going to do is recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, adversity, and toxic stress. You'll notice in this definition, in those you serve, but as important as in your coworkers and in the staff and the workforce. So I hope that you will start to see, starting right now, if you're new to this thing called trauma-informed care, or if you've heard it differently, that in our work around trauma-informed care, the workforce is where we actually spend a lot of time in my work in Oregon, because if we have a well workforce, then we can kind of provide trauma-informed care to those we serve. So we're going to realize, we're going to recognize, and then we're going to respond by integrating this knowledge about the impact of trauma, adversity, toxic stress into policies, procedures, and practice. And I love that is this order because, again, it's a reminder that we're talking about policies and procedures that will then influence practice. The reason I emphasize that is often when people hear trauma-informed care, just because of its name, or trauma-informed approach, they tend to think of individuals who've experienced trauma and working with those individuals. And again, we're going to keep reminding you, or I'm going to keep reminding you today that this is about organizational change, which is what this evaluative toolkit is going to be talking about. The fourth R is we resist. We resist re-traumatizing people. We resist causing new trauma in people as the organization or system. Now, it's important to take a moment here and note that a lot of the work we do is traumatizing for communities. And so we're always going to try to prevent that from happening. And if we can't prevent that from happening, we're going to understand it's happening and then mitigate and kind of do work around that. Now, before we get too far, let's take a moment to just talk about this word trauma. Think for a moment, like right now, think for a moment, if you were to define trauma to the person sitting beside you or to a family member or to a neighbor, how would you define trauma? Think about how your organization defines trauma or how the system you work in defines trauma. And I'm going to give you some ideas about that, but this is a really lovely practice to do in your work, is to think about how you all talk about trauma as you move through this, because the word means different things to different people, and it means different things across systems. So healthcare is going to think about the word trauma differently than behavioral healthcare is going to think about the word trauma, et cetera. So in my work, we really ask people to expand their understanding of how they understand or define trauma, because we realize it's really different for everyone. There are certain events that are always traumatic. And then there are events that are traumatic to some and not traumatic to others. And then there are events that the event itself, let's take divorce, may not be traumatic, but the effect of that, if it propels you into economic deprivation, now we have the experiences of trauma and toxic stress. We also include the experience of collective, historical, and generational trauma. And what I hope that you're thinking about is oftentimes these aren't the things that are on our checkbox list, right? They're not in our assessment instruments. And so that's why we really want you to kind of expand that understanding of what trauma is, because that's what we're going to be talking about. Right now, there are many people experiencing toxic stress and trauma as a result of racial violence, COVID-19, devastation of wildfires and floods. So we all are having some collective experience right now with toxic stress and trauma, and it's really important for us to note that that is not happening in the same way in all communities. So disproportionately, communities are experiencing what we call like accumulated, prolonged toxic stress and trauma because what that community was already experiencing with what's happening currently. Other words you've heard me say and that you might want to do some work around are words such as toxic stress, words such as scarcity, because the brain on scarcity, when people are experiencing scarcity, is very similar to what we think about the impact of trauma. You're going to hear me use the word adversity. I really encourage you to spend some time in your communities and in your work to kind of figure out what words really resonate and speak to the full experience of those that you serve, as well as your workforce, because sometimes the word trauma isn't always the word that's preferred. All right, can we have the next slide, please? So a big important message that we make about trauma-informed care is the difference in trauma-specific services and trauma-informed care. So trauma-specific services are interventions that are focused on individuals, families, and groups to help alleviate the symptomologies or the impact of trauma and toxic stress, and hopefully promote healing, resiliency, post-trauma growth. But again, they're geared towards the individual, family, or group. Trauma-informed care is focused on the organization, right? So it's changing how the organization does its work. So we take this knowledge about trauma and adversity, we focus it on our policies and our procedures, and we think about how do these policies and procedures either activate or neutralize the stress response system so that people can engage in the work in the service that we have or in the work that we do. I like to say to people that trauma-informed care is the adjective, not the noun. Right? Like people need food, they need clothing, they need shelter, they need health care. They need those things to be provided in a trauma-informed way so that the engagement into those services can happen. All right, next slide, please. So why bother with trauma-informed care is a really important question that you need to be thinking about, and we will be looking at some of the tools in the toolkit that actually will help you think about that. So why it's important, what we talk about in my work is a couple things. Trauma is pervasive. It happens in a lot of ways across a lot of different communities. It is life-shaping, and it is impactful over time in ways and kind of symptoms that are challenging, but also in resiliency and in growth. Where we spend a lot of our time is in that third line there that says service systems can reactivate or re-traumatize. So trauma-informed care, in the sense of why bother, is because our service system, the policies we have, the procedures we have, the ways we have to get to and fro offices, what needs to be turned in, our timelines, all of these things can often cause activation of the stress response system. And here's the big thing about this is what's worrisome and concerning is that maybe the way that we do the work is causing a difficulty with engagement, but it's often we blame the individual or the family for then the lack of that engagement. So that's why trauma-informed care really is a critical component of a program. We also say that trauma-informed care is critical for those who've experienced trauma, systemic oppression to engage in services, but it's also welcoming of anyone. When you think about what it looks like to be trauma-informed, regardless of your history of trauma, you're going to desire those things: trustworthiness, safety, empowerment. And we have ways to do this. We really do have ways that we can do things differently that help people. And so that's why it's important that we take this kind of lens of trauma-informed care in the work that we do. All right, next slide, please. So I added this slide because I don't know if some of you are like me, whereas that when you have this thing like trauma-informed care, it's like, what does that mean? And if you talk to a lot of us who do the work, we'll say, well, it kind of means different things to different people, which is sometimes not very helpful. So when I'm trying to figure out what something is, sometimes I try to figure out what it's not, and it helps me think about it that way. So a couple things to compare this. So trauma-informed care is not about excusing or justifying unacceptable behavior. It is supporting accountability and responsibility. But we're going to do that a little differently. We're going to add into that, like, that may not be the best behavior, but we're going to talk about why we understand that behavior is happening from a lens of trauma, right? So we can hold people accountable. We can ask people to hold responsibility, but we're going to do that with caring, compassion, and knowledge around the impact of trauma and how that might be playing. It's not about just being nicer. It's actually about practicing compassion. And I challenge you right now for you to think about, like, what does she mean by that? And think if you can figure out the difference. Is there something different about just being nicer for today versus actually practicing compassion? It doesn't focus on the negative. So you can do trauma-informed care and not use the word trauma. It's not about asking people about their trauma. It's not about talking about the negativity of all the things all the time. It is absolutely about focusing on skill building, strength-based, healing-centered, and resilience. We're just going to use our knowledge about the impact of trauma, toxic stress, to do that work even better, right? So maybe instead of a 2-hour skills class, you want to break it off into 30 minutes a couple times a week, right? So it's not the end-all, be-all, right? It's a commitment to a process. You don't get trauma-informed, right? It's a process. It's a culture change. And people need services, right? So trauma-informed care isn't like you have to have something to offer people. Those things need to be trauma-informed in the way that they're offered. It's not just attending a training, right? A lot of people, it's like they attend a training. Knowledge is important, but you're going to take that information back to transforming your spaces and your practices, your procedures, your policies. You want to start to embed things so that culture starts to shift because it takes time. This is a really important one to me. It's not about moving work away from diversity, equity, inclusion, or even resilience work. So what happens a lot of times in organizations is that they are experiencing a lot of burden and they're doing a lot of work and they're trying to kind of do the best work. So they'll have a diversity, equity, inclusion work that's happening. Trauma-informed care will come into that space, and all of a sudden people move to trauma-informed care and are not paying attention to the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racist work, because talking about racism can be harder, and so they move to trauma-informed care work. And then they move to resiliency work because resiliency feels more strength-based. And so I'm just really going to ask you to kind of help yourself and others hold that all of those things are going to be important. And I'm excited for the toolkit because I think in the toolkit you're going to see all of those things show up because we need the connection between all of that work. It's not one versus the other. It's also not something new. So many of you are already trauma-informed. In your individualized practice, your programs are already trauma-informed. If you work in culturally specific programs or within cultures that have experienced marginalization and you've been successful, then you've been doing trauma-informed care. So important to really note that. Now we call it trauma-informed care. All right, next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I just want you to know that these are like the principles of trauma-informed care, because we're going to come back to this and when we talk about the toolkit. But these principles really are a guiding kind of foundation, a framework, whatever works for you. And so everything is going to come through these principles. You should take some time to think about why these particular principles are related to folks who've experienced trauma and adversity and toxic stress, right? So why do these folks need to feel a sense of safety, trustworthiness? Why do we need those things? Really important point. And so when we go into organizations, we're going to be asking, to what extent do your staff and those you serve feel physically safe and emotionally safe? What policies and procedures are promoting trustworthiness for your staff and for those you serve? I do want to just pull your attention, if you're staring off into your 20 feet away, maybe take a moment to look back at the screen and look at those implementation domains. And the reason they're not exciting, but I want you to look at them because it's like governance, cross-sector, financing, policy. A lot of these there's only like 3 implementation domains that are really kind of focused on direct practice work. And it's just another reminder that trauma-informed care is kind of all of it, right? It's doing all of that work. Next slide, please. All right, this is just another way to think about this work. And again, I won't spend too much time on this, but I want to offer this to you because as you do the work, you're going to need to find the way that this works within your setting and in your community and wherever you're located. So trauma-informed care really stands on some assumptions, and these are similar assumptions in the toolkit, that we are working, human service setting is populated by those who've experienced trauma, both in our workforce and our coworkers and those we serve, and that the service setting can either reactivate or can be a healing agent for folks. We have things that are helpful. What I want to kind of hone your attention on is, right, we're striving for, no trauma happening, the prevention of trauma, health and wellness. But we're going to back that up into, in order to get to health and wellness, we really need people engaged. So we really see trauma-informed care as an engagement tool. So we're two levels of engagement. Is staff engaged? Look at your retention, like how does that look? And then also, are those you're serving engaged in the way that is helpful for the service to be successful? People engage, both staff and those we serve, if they feel safe, empowered, valued, cared for, believe the organization has their back, and trust the organization's staff and leadership. So that's what we're going to really hone in on, trying to measure and see what's happening. How to do that, what you need to do that, is what we're going to be talking about next as we look at kind of Vermont's experience and what the toolkit offers in the sense of some examples of how to kind of move to that place. But no matter what you do, you're striving for that sense of experience from the workforce and those you serve about those principles of trauma-informed care. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a poll. I'm going to turn over to James, actually.
Okay, yes, thanks. So we're going to move you guys into another poll question, and you should see that on the screen before you, which asks, in what areas or domains would you like more tips or help as your TANF agency or programs move to a more trauma-informed practice? And your responses are below, and you can select them as you see appropriate, and in about 30 seconds, we'll pull up the results.
All right, so as we move in, what I'm hearing is that we got about 34% of folks who would like tips to re-examine. Sorry, I have half those things. All right, so as we're going to look at those poll results, and then we're going to use those as when Andrea comes forward, we'll talk about how some of the toolkit can be kind of geared towards some of those desires that you're asking for here. So we have some folks interested in physical environment. We have some folks for kind of re-examining policies and procedures. And some additional training resources. So excellent. And then increasing organizational capacity. All right, so I am excited. Next, can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm excited next to invite Nicole into the conversation. And Nicole, I'm waiting to see your face pop up.
Hi.
Hi. So Nicole, and so folks on the webinar, what we're going to move into now is really conversation. So there's like just this slide, and there'll be one more slide up. And so again, I hope that you can kind of sit back and put some questions in as you are. Nicole is going to talk about the experience in Vermont, and then Andrea is going to come forward and talk about the toolkit, and then we might do some talking together. So Nicole, I'd love it if you want to introduce yourself any differently than already has, but really asking you to start by talking about the overview of Vermont's journey related to trauma-informed care. And I know Mary mentioned a little bit, but I'm excited to hear kind of, because I know some of it started pretty far back around maybe some legislation.
Yeah. So I am Nicole Dubuque. I'm the Reach Up program manager in Vermont. Reach Up is our TANF program. And yeah, Mary touched on it a little bit, and we have had a pretty long journey in Vermont. It's definitely been a marathon, not a sprint. So as far back as 1999 is when we really started with some trauma work, introduced legislation in 2003. I think where we started to kind of fast track up to where we're at today was in 2016 when the Agency of Human Services, which is the agency that our TANF program is under, adopted the Strengthening Families framework. And as a key component of the Strengthening Families framework, it's really strength-based resilience development across the departments is what our aim was. And I know in the toolkit you can find kind of our full journey from 99 forward, and then also a lot about the Strengthening Families framework in Chapter 6 of the toolkit. So from there, in 2018, Vermont passed legislation that reinstated the position of a director of trauma prevention within our agency. That position is held by a woman named Auburn Watersong, and she did a lot of help with us developing this toolkit. She worked a lot with Andrea and Mary on this. She has extensive experience in the field. And then really from there, within Reach Up specifically, what we started looking at was creating and updating our mission and vision. And so the Reach Up program's mission is that Reach Up joins families on their journey to overcome obstacles, explore opportunities, improve their finances, and reach their goals. And our vision is families will be empowered, connected, and thriving. And so we developed our mission through a very collaborative process. We worked with program participants, community partners, and staff on this. And then we really realized we need to make sure that our policies, our procedures, our rules are really adhering to that mission and vision. And for us, that meant the Strengthening Families framework and also making sure that we're really being trauma-informed about how we're making these alterations and updates. So in 2019, I reached out to PeerTA and made a request for technical assistance to conduct an assessment of Vermont Reach Up program, our current rules, and identifying changes that would allow the program to be more trauma-informed. So that's where our journey came to PeerTA.
Excellent. One of the two things one of the two things I think is really interesting about that is what I'm hearing. I think it's important for people to hear is that it's not, right, like you said, this was a marathon. Like this isn't something you do overnight. And it also, and reading through the toolkit also about the story of Vermont was that there are layers of needs, right? There's legislation, there's infrastructure, there's taking, so it's kind of, I think that's going to be an important point as we move through this.
Yeah.
I'm interested, because I think you spoke to this, but I want you to be able to put that out there. If there were particular issues, as you asked for this peer assessment, right, were there particular issues in the Vermont's Reach Up program that you felt needed to be addressed? So say that if that feels relevant, but I think what I'm really interested in people hearing about was about that site visit, because as I've heard you all talk about that was a pretty pivotal and helpful experience.
Yeah, so there were definitely several things that we saw within the program, and a lot of that came up when we were, creating the mission and vision. People telling us about policies and practices that they were seeing. A lot of that, like the most obvious ones, were unnecessary and potentially re-traumatizing eligibility requirements. So, when people are first coming through the door to us to apply for these benefit programs, specifically TANF, we had to recognize like what their bandwidth is in this time of often, desperate times in their life to apply for this program. And so one of the first things that we did was look at when people first come to us, what are some things that we don't need to have them do in that moment. And so One of those was going through an orientation because we just realized people don't have the bandwidth to absorb all that information right off the bat, and it would be better for them to develop a relationship first. And then also we had a requirement for in-person interview, which we waived. So those were two things that we did. And then for the PeerTA site visit, I think we had already talked with the team about what we wanted and what we had started for work. So it was really helpful for the group to come to Vermont and see our landscape, to really see, like, what do our offices look like? What is our structure? How does central office look, and how are we organized? And so we had a representative from PeerTA come, Dr. Hetling came, the Manhattan Strategies team, and they met with our Reach Up central office staff. They met with leadership within our agency, including Auburn, who I mentioned. They also went to one of our district offices and spent time in the district with eligibility staff, with case management staff, with supervisors there, and really spent a lot of thoughtful time talking to us about exactly what was going on in Vermont, the types of trauma that we might have experienced, our policies and procedures. That was great. And then Dr. Hetling actually came back to Vermont in October of 2019. So the first site visit was in May. We worked through a lot of the pieces of the toolkit at that point. And then in October, Dr. Hetling came back and actually presented at our all staff day. So all of our Reach Up staff were in one place, and she talked about, building a trauma-informed TANF program, and really was able to introduce the idea of the toolkit there, which I found incredibly helpful.
There's so much there. So a couple of things. I'm getting some feedback, so I'm going to wait. So a couple of things. I appreciated that, and we might want to get to this later because I want to get to some other things too, but I wonder how much people might want to hear how you collected information from those you served, to hear about some of those things that were re-traumatized, or maybe it was from staff. But I really want to point out that I appreciate this kind of first point of entry work that often happens, because most agencies start with that first point of entry. Because right after people have a relationship with you, they can then engage in more things, even if they aren't perfect things. But things like the first things we do with folks that often have people not come back or get activated or leave, So I just appreciate it when you said that. I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Was there I'm interested in, was there anything about that site visit? It sounds like site visit might actually have also been trauma-informed, because it sounds like everyone was involved in that, which sounds lovely. I wasn't there. But I'm wondering, because sometimes when people come into a site for a site visit or to come look at something, that can be activating for staff. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to how that worked for you? I mean, it sounds like it went well. So.
Yeah, I mean, it worked well for us. We did some, kind of pre-work before the site visit happened. So we did do participant focus groups. So we went to every one of our districts and met with folks who are actually participating in the Reach Up program at that moment, and collected feedback from them that way. And then we also collected feedback from our staff in all the offices about what they were looking for and what they felt like they needed more clarification on. So we did that prior to, and then we did ask the district office that the team went to in advance if they would be amenable to this, if they would be willing to have folks come in and talk to them, and really kind of tried to prepare them for what the conversation should be, or would be, not should be. But so we tried to do it that way so that it wasn't like people coming in and feeling like they were being evaluated.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Because it sounds like it was the motivation to call in that support was to kind of move y'all from the awareness, right, into getting some work done. And so it sounds like that was a way to get that happening. And I keep pointing that out because I think a lot of people are in that, okay, I'm ready, but what do I do next? It sounds like that was a helpful next step for you all.
Yeah, that's where we were, for sure.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm going to join these questions, and you can correct me and not join them, because I know, how trauma-informed care, so, you've done this work, we have this toolkit, and you all are starting to implement that, which we'll talk about also. But do you have an idea, how does this fit into client-centered coaching? where's trauma-informed care into that work, especially as, you have an audience of folks who are working in a similar program who might be like, how do I merge this into that work? So how does trauma-informed care speak to some of that for you?
So I think it's really about, for one, trauma-informed care is really at the core of our mission and vision and other work that we've done. And I know we're probably going to talk about assessments a little bit later, but it's really about meeting the participant where they're at and finding out what their goals are, and not, starting with policies and procedures and practices that are going to make people feel like we are digging further into their lives than we need to, or that we are being prescriptive in what they need to do for themselves. I feel like it's really about being centered on what that family needs and what their goals are, and helping them achieve those goals rather than setting them for them.
And the reason I, want to spend time there for a moment is, again, I think people worry sometimes it's like another thing to do. And it very much feels like it. When you first read off your mission and vision, I was like, oh, that's trauma-informed, right? Even though it didn't use the word trauma-informed care. So I think that's important for people to hear, that it often is matching up to the work that you're already involved in or doing or believe in. Mm-hmm. So let's talk now a little bit about, like, what do you think about assessments and maybe things that are going to change, or you hope to change, or you're involved in right now, about what's going to look different as you implement this work?
So in Vermont, we've already implemented several elements of the toolkit, and a big shift for us has been the assessment process. So we started with a very invasive assessment process that really required applicants to share a lot about their life, especially before a relationship had been developed with the Reach Up case manager. So that was kind of done on the onset, this very invasive, categorized prescriptive assessment. And we've moved to using a tool called Stepping Stones, which really focuses on setting goals in areas that the participant feels are important. So it's not really an assessment, it's more of a tool to help them develop this plan for their family going forward, and how to set small goals and go from there. And I found it very successful. I feel like kind of what you said before, Mandy, about it's one more thing to do, but frequently we have found that when we use these tools and we use these models, that rather than kind of assigning somebody like, you need to just apply for any job that's open and get one, versus setting their goals to look into different career paths, that we actually find much more success that way.
I was just sitting here. I was sitting here thinking that I just love the shift from the word assessment, right? Like, because that even just means something that people doesn't feel as engaged as developing a goal plan or a plan with somebody about how they're moving forward. And it sounds like, I already hear some of those principles in that process, right? Instead of just saying you need to go do ABC, actually making it individualized. There's multiple paths of recovery, right? All those things that we've kind of been talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm interested maybe, and I want to bring Andrea into the conversation so we can introduce the toolkit and then have some time to have some conversation. But I do want to, Nicole, is there any one thing in this process from Vermont, from the beginning, from 1999 to today, but really more maybe like the last few years, that has been really a helpful or pivotal point, or like a critical ingredient, or one of the things you would say to these programs who we have a lot of folks who I think are interested but at the beginning of their work? Is there something that you would recommend for them?
I really think it needs to be a bottom-up approach. Like, I really think you need to not, start at leadership and decide what needs to be done for the program. I think you need to start by talking to people that are participating in the program, and what about the program would be more helpful for them, and then, go up to the workers, that the people doing the eligibility, and find out how we can work like that. I really think bottom-up is been really helpful for us.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think bottom-up is often interesting because it often is just way more efficient. Right? Like, what might work? We could have lots of committee meetings to talk about it, or we could ask people what might work best, and it often helps us get there in a better way. And then we need to bring in leadership also, and so that'll. Andrea, can I invite you into the conversation? So for those of you in the webinar, if you have access to the toolkit, you can pull it up. I have it spread across my office. Sorry, can we go ahead and advance that slide? So this slide is just showing you the chapters in the toolkit, and so you can kind of see, if you haven't seen the toolkit yet, you can look at this and see what's available to you as we talk about it, and then we'll be kind of referring to it. But Andrea, welcome, and I'm interested in maybe you can introduce yourself differently or add as you'd like to that, but then, talk about how you got involved with Vermont's Reach Up journey, Trauma-Informed Care journey.
Of course. Thank you, Mandy. And I'm just so excited to be here today. And this whole conversation is about, Vermont's journey. And I feel like we also had a PeerTA journey. For my participation started with an email from Mary saying, hey, Mary and I had met years ago at a TANF-related conference, and she had remembered that I was doing some work at the time on the family violence option, which is a piece of the TANF program that deals with survivors of domestic violence. So Mary said, do you happen to know of any resources that we could use? And I said, you know what, not off the top of my head. So I did a little digging. She and I continued talking. And at one point she said, hey, why don't you come on board? Why don't you join the team? Why don't you be our content expert? And at first I was sort of like, well, what does that mean? I had not worked on a PeerTA project before. I am an associate professor at Rutgers, and my primary obligations are research and teaching. I do some service, but the project that Mary was describing sort of merged all of those responsibilities in a really fun way for me. When I first got my PhD, I hadn't planned on going into academia. I worked before embarking on my doctoral program, and I worked at a domestic violence agency. And my motivation for studying public policy was sort of almost, I didn't talk about it or think about it in this way at the time, but it was really this move from a trauma services type agency working with those individuals and families to think more holistically about trauma-informed care. How can we improve those systems? And I started my studies in sort of the mid-90s. It's when welfare reform was happening, and it became very obvious to me at the time that this new program that was developing was mismatched in some ways with the needs of the families I was working with at the time. So when Mary called me and we started talking about the project, my answer was an enthusiastic yes. I mean, the ability to sort of work with those at the ground level on issues that I've been interested in and researching was, a great opportunity, and frankly, the whole experience exceeded my expectations.
Excellent. I was reflecting off my own path. It was very similar in the world of academics and service. So I've been really interested in the site visit process, part of that journey. And so I want you to talk about it, but I also, and I know that you will, but it's kind of like, what about that part? So it's like there's the things that got done in there, but also what kind of the process of needing to do that or wanting to do that is also contributing to it being, like, how was that done in a trauma-informed way, and how is that contributing to helping move it forward? Because I'm thinking there are people out there like, is that something I need to do or should do, or is that helpful? So I think, can you talk a little bit about your experience of that and what lessons you would share with others about having that happen?
That's a great question, Mandy. And I think one of the sort of motivating factors for my joining the PeerTA team was Mary's description of this being a very active, engaging, and responsive task. It wasn't that Vermont called up and said, hey, can you do this for us? And we, as our little group of, researchers and think tank staff and whatever, sat together in our little lonesome and wrote something up and then gave it back to them. It was very much a learning process on both ends. As Nicole described, when we conducted the site visit, we didn't just meet with state leaders and the sort of top administrators of the Reach Up program. Vermont was very much motivated to get us and out in the field. So we went to the Barre District office and we met with caseworkers, we met with eligibility workers, and we learned from their experiences. And it really was a insightful, slightly overwhelming day. Doing field work like that can be exhausting because you're doing a lot of active listening. We went in prepared, we had our little list of questions, and oftentimes you have to go off script because the conversation goes someplace else. And we learned things we didn't imagine learning, and the version of the toolkit, this table of contents and tools you see here today, it didn't look like that when we first outlined it. It's been an iterative process. It's been a, hey, Nicole, can you take a look at this, chapter? Or Auburn, does this match with how the state's been, doing this approach? I am hoping Vermont also felt like that it was a learning process for them, but it definitely was for us. And I am 100% certain we would not have been able to get to this product without the engagement of state leaders, of county workers, of really everyone involved in the Vermont Reach Up program.
Thank you. I was thinking that it's often the thing that we rush through because it takes time to listen and to redo things, right? Like one of my big principles is we're going to redo it 3 or 4 times before it gets done. All right. I know. We just remind people to please. I'm going to maybe see if the web can handle that. So what I want to move us to is I want to talk a little bit about what you learned in the literature and also in the site visit around TANF and trauma-informed care. And then I want to move into knowing the programs that are listening, how can they use the toolkit and what are some skills and those type of things. So in going to the site visit and doing literature and kind of thinking about looking at what else was already done, were there some things that came out about trauma-informed care application within TANF programs that, resonated with you or was a surprise to you, or some areas in which you were like, oh, this hasn't been done, or this is new, or these are things we want to focus on, to kind of set that stage of this intersection of that work?
Sure. So, early on in the toolkit, we have a little preface that sort of, it says, so what exactly can I use this toolkit for? And we have a little section, sort of like you did early on, Mandy, of, what it is and what it is not. And starting with this, what it is not, first thing that we wrote was it's not completely new. We didn't write this from scratch. There is a lot of robust and deep information and resources out there already on how to do trauma-informed care. Some of which isn't, as you noted, isn't even labeled trauma-informed care. It's good practice that intersects with the work that we're doing. So I think the hardest part of the task was really combing through all of that information and thinking through how it applied to the TANF program. And this is where really Vermont was able to offer a lot of great insights. We found quite a bit of information related to human services agencies more generally speaking, not very much on TANF in particular. There are a handful of states that have done a little bit, but not very much on sort of overarching guidance. Definitely on working with low-income families, working with different groups that have experienced different types of trauma, but in thinking about the parameters of TANF, we didn't find much out there. And I think that the hardest conversation that we had as a team, and when I say we, I mean, Mary and the rest of the PeerTA team and Nicole and Auburn and just everyone sort of involved in this collaborative effort, was the need to recognize the pieces of the TANF program that are restrictive, that present real challenges. When you think about the time limit, when you think about the sanctioning processes, it's hard to think about those in a trauma-informed way. And I think that those were the most challenging, but also some of the most important conversations we had in thinking about this systems level approach and then applying it to a set of regulations and policies that, especially on the surface of it, doesn't seem that trauma-informed.
Thank you. Because this is really important, right? Because it's kind of that like resist re-traumatization. Like there's a lot of things we do that is re-traumatizing and traumatizing, and we either can't change that or, you know, and so we have to then at least be knowledgeable and aware of what we're doing and do our best to mitigate, right? It's like removal of somebody from a home is always traumatizing, but there are ways to do that we can then build in that, you know, work towards the resilience, repair, restore work that needs to happen also. I'm gonna stay here for a minute because we're here and I want to go here. And there's a couple of things. I want to move to those principles, and I know I mentioned it, and folks, if this is new to you, no expectation that you'll remember these. But the principles of trauma-informed care: safety, empowerment, transparency, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, the recognition, understanding of culture, history, and gender, both as its impact on and regarding systemic oppression, but also culture as healing. So all of those are the things we look at organizations through, and the toolkit speaks to those. So if you have it, you can access, you'll have that information there. But kind of on the same line of thought, Andrea, like this is the trauma-informed care. These are the principles those of us who do this work with. And then what I love about the toolkit is it's specific to TANF, because that's where we need to start heading to move it into application. So are any of those principles, you know, did you find these things, because that's what to me, where you're getting ready to talk, what you're talking about, some of these things are harder than that to match up in a program. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of stick in there, and you can tell me I'm wrong about this, but I really found like tool 3, the mismatch tool, might help with some of that. And I know it's not principle-based, but it definitely was like take a policy and kind of see. And so I don't know if that makes sense to speak to now, but I appreciated that tool to help with that.
Well, I'm glad you liked it, Mandy. That means a lot to me and to the team. I think both sort of tool 1 and tool 3 kind of go hand in hand in that regard. Tool 1 takes those 6 principles that Mandy just listed, provides the SAMHSA, the full SAMHSA definition of those, and then kind of presents this series of questions that sort of different agencies, different groups of individual and TANF programs can really think through. How does this definition work in the work that I do? How does that apply to the TANF program? How can we consider something like peer support? And in what ways might we be able to change policies or practices to facilitate that? Peer support has not been sort of an underlying aspect of all TANF approaches, but there's definitely been some pilot work and smaller programs with mom support groups and others that have integrated that. So tool 1 sort of just gives you some vocabulary to start having those conversations, and then tool 3 really allows sort of that conversation to continue, right? So in what ways, I have to like look at my little cheat sheet here, and this is where I wish we could kind of go back and forth, but it's the orangish one. The toolkit is color-coded if you have access to a color printer, or looking at it on your screen, of course. But it goes through those principles, and it sort of asks you to think about how well you feel your agency is addressing those or thinking about those or growing. I love the analogy that this is a marathon. This is surely not something that you kind of pick this up, you go through the chapters, check it off, and you're like, I'm done, because we're kind of never done. This is a process of continual improvement. So sort of the notes section on here asks the sort of respondent, what are some areas to improve? What steps must be taken to make changes? So I just sort of want to emphasize that this is not a one and done. None of these tools are one and done. It's a process of thinking about where you are now, where you want to be, what little steps you can do, and then kind of repeating periodically.
Yeah, repetition, I think, is not used enough. So So what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask you to maybe talk for about 5-ish minutes or however around just the toolkit. So, and then Nicole, I'd like to invite you with Andrea to talk a little bit about, what are some best practices or some skills and resources that you think organizations really might think about moving into. And I also want to ask a little bit about how workforce wellness shows up in the toolkit, because it does, and I think that's important to point out. So Andrea, talk a little bit about, sometimes those of us who are in practice and hear toolkit, we're like, we're going to get a 3-binder and we're going to have to flip through some pages, and so it's not always the best-selling word, right? And so I really hope that right now, for those of you who are out there, this is your time to kind of get your fidgets and kind of re-engage for a moment, because what I'm excited about the toolkit is that and there's a hard balance in trying to not be prescriptive, like do this, because people want to know what to do, with also providing something that's helpful. And I think this toolkit's done a nice job of that. So Andrea, I'd like to turn over and just have you talk to folks and kind of help them relate to this toolkit maybe a little bit about what's available for them and as they access it.
I think that's a perfect way of framing it, and I think it was a hard balance to sort of come to, and I'll be curious to hear Nicole's insights, because part of the back and forth with the chapters of the toolkit was sort of the development of these tools that are really, designed to kind of be reflective and used continually, with some really concrete guidance, because as you said, we all like to feel at the end of the day that we've done something. We haven't just talked and talked and talked and thought and thought and thought, but we can say, but we did this. So it was a little bit of a balance and challenging at times, because some of those best practices, even the ones that are in the toolkit, I'm quite certain 5 years from now, I'll pick this up and go, why did I put that in as a best practice? Because we learn over time. I mean, even now, one of the things that I wish we had thought about more, of course, we did all of this pre-COVID-19 pandemic. So we in the toolkit, and someone asked a question about sort of engaging with clients over the telephone, but we had not imagined the world that we live in now with the, strong inability in many places. I'm in New Jersey, and TANF offices across the state are engaging in different practices, but many of them do not have the in-person option at all. So we spend a lot of time, or not a lot of time, we have a chapter on physical space, which is something that people aren't caring about as much right now. Hopefully we'll be able to care about it in a year or so. But I wish we had done more on sort of the virtual aspects, communication. Again, we just kind of hadn't envisioned this. So I'm hoping the toolkit has a good balance of, tried and true, like sort of these guiding thinking questions that we can always come back to, and some concrete tips and guidance that we can apply now, recognizing that we do learn. The science and research changes, and we will learn over time. We had the wonderful opportunity, because I will tell you that my typical academic articles do not look this pretty at all. Mary and Val, another member of the team, had us work with actually a designer to put this together. So at the very least, I really appreciated the use of color to organize the chapters and the tools. It is definitely designed so that you can kind of, look at the chapters, look at the tools, and kind of, skim around. It's not meant to sort of be an intensive one-time read, start to finish. You have to block off 6 hours. You can do it different pieces. The breakout boxes, the tools, the different sort of design layouts, I think makes this a much more user-friendly document than I've ever been able to produce.
And it's not 400 pages, so that was helpful.
It's not 400 pages, but I do want to sort of, that reminds me, at the end of each chapter, there's a little box that says, where can I find more information? Again, None of these ideas in here are really mine. They exist. They're out there. We've pulled information and expertise and best practice guidelines and insights from all over the place. So at the end of each chapter, we try to guide the reader towards a few of those other places that we found to be really helpful.
Excellent. I was thinking that you might just need to do an appendix or an addendum around COVID response, right? And offer that up. I say that with also saying that I think if you go through the principles of trauma-informed care, what I love about basing it in the principles or in a framework is that things are going to continue to shift in ways that we don't expect. Like if we've learned anything, we've learned that. And so, so you can take these things and be like, okay, well now what does that look like, and how do I look at it from a lens of safety and trustworthiness and all those type of things? And so I hope that people will see that as they utilize the toolkit. I also really appreciate it's not again, everyone in the organization could pick this up, and it feels it's accessible in that way. And if the whole agency is not ready, then maybe a program could pick this up and pilot this and walk through it with the reflective questions. So I appreciate that part as well. All right. Is there anything else about the toolkit specifically, Andrea, you want to point out before? Because I'd like to then bring Nicole in for the last few minutes, and then we'll open it up. I know we have some questions coming in, so we want to get to those too.
No, let's bring Nicole back in, and let's try to get to those questions too.
Yeah, excellent. So Nicole, go ahead, and we're going to make sure we're all going to unmute and see if we get feedback, we'll stop that. But which of the multiple questions I want to ask you in my time frame. I want to speak. I guess I want to ask you first, just like if you have any tips of like what resources. Again, if there's any kind of first step that you think, or a first way to enter this toolkit, or anything that an organization needs to kind of take that first step. If it was it was really important that leadership say yes, it was really important to have the support of something to help move things forward. And then Nicole, I also I know you've, I think, rolled out the toolkit, and so if there's any advice you have around that and how people are engaging with that.
Yeah, so we're really just rolling out the toolkit. Like I said, Andrea came in October of 2019, so almost a year ago now, and kind of introduced the idea of it. But with COVID and being out of the office, we recently disseminated it to staff, and our plan is to continuing to do ongoing professional development using the toolkit and to do further trainings, probably virtually, but maybe hopefully in person sometime in the future. So that's what we're doing with the toolkit. I think, the really important step is kind of, you touched on it, Maddie, is that you need really buy-in from leadership, but really from all the levels. You need to, like I said in the beginning, we talk to people participating in the program. We talk to the district offices, central office, leadership. I think everyone really needs to be part of the process the whole way through. We have made sure that all of those levels have been involved in knowing we made a PeerTA request. We're creating an evaluative toolkit. Here's a sample. This is what we're doing, and making sure that we had buy-in from all parties the whole way through.
Nicole, what, if any, resistance popped up? I mean, I know when I go in and I'm doing this work, there's a lot of resistance of, I don't have enough time for this. This isn't what my job description is. This is another thing to do. I mean, and it's legit resistance. And so I think it's good for us to come. What were some of the concerns from staff, if any, that were talked about?
I think one more thing on the plate, right? So there's a lot of guidelines and auditable things that could be audited with paperwork that needs to go through TANF programs and stuff. So I think initially the concern is, how is this going to have to shift my daily practice? And is it going to be a big shift? Is this just adding a lot more to my plate? And then also, is it going to add a lot more to the participant? Because are we going to be asking them to do the standard paperwork plus these new tools? And so I think we've tried to be really transparent with, this is going to be a shift, and we really don't want it to be additional work. We actually want it to be the opposite. We want to get rid of unnecessary paperwork and unnecessary steps to be taken to just hone in on the relationship and the goals of the participant. So I think that's probably, I don't know if I'd call it resistance, but fears that were expressed.
Mandy, can I jump? Oh, sorry, Nicole, you weren't done.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay. If I could jump in for a second about the All Staff Day. When I came last October to introduce the toolkit and speak directly to staff, Nicole, how many did we have? I mean, there were over 100 people probably, or close to it, that were there participating in the All Staff Day.
Yeah, about 125.
And I think that one of the realizations that was sort of made in the Q&A was sort of so wait a minute, you're actually talking about having the state and supervisors and policymakers really think about the system here and making changes. It's not the sort of responsibility of transformation does not rest solely on caseworkers. And I think that, Mandy, you had asked earlier, and I think I got off on a tangent, so I didn't really answer, but you had asked a little bit about sort of the workforce development issue and staff training. And, there's a chapter in the toolkit on secondary traumatic stress and the impact of casework on staff. And really, a trauma-informed system of care has to also address the needs of staff, not just of clients. And I think that All Staff Day, even if there was some concerns or reluctance at the beginning of the conversation, I think that by the end, people were excited and welcoming of kind of this reframing and thinking about things in a new way, particularly when we talked about staff and secondary stress, and that, even the solutions in that regard, it shouldn't and can't fall on the staff. It can't be, well, you just need to take some time and you just need to. It's also how supervisors react. It's also how whole agencies react. It's the toolkit. Tool 6 is sort of secondary stress and strategies to address that. And there's level of responsibility, and there's level of responsibility at the organization level, at the supervisor level, and finally at things that the individual themselves can do as well. But the burden of transformation doesn't rest solely on caseworkers. And I think once people understand that, it's an easier conversation to have.
Absolutely. Tool number 6, I have it flagged in my notes too. It's like, that is visually my favorite tool in the tool. I think it's so well laid out.
Excellent. That's what needs to happen in all of our systems, right? Because if we don't have the well workforce, we can't ask the workforce to do things that create wellness in those they serve. And it's been, and in human services, I think has been a really neglected. I was raised as a self-care model, right? Like, go take care of yourself, versus the workforce wellness model, which is the organization has a responsibility. There's a partnership in that work. And so I was grateful to see that, because it is where I think we're actually starting to put some attention, which is lovely. I'm going to wrap up this section because I hear we have a lot of questions that have come in, so I want to be able to turn it over. And I'm going to wrap up by just saying the other part that I really found helpful was like the tool 4, but the conversation around protective factors, because I think it was a reminder that we talk about trauma-informed care is based on neuroscience, neurobiology, epigenetics, adverse child experience, and resilience. And I think sometimes this movement can forget the healing resilience part of the work, or cannot hear that in the materials that are out there. So it's like, what is the prevalence of trauma? So I just really I'm excited that's in there, and I think it's a great way for people to that's the work, is building protective factors, and how are we doing that with the knowledge of how those have been impacted due to the multitude of trauma people have experienced. So I'm going to turn it over to James and maybe Mary to hear some of the questions you all have.
Sounds good, Mandy. Thank you so much for facilitating that conversation. It was great. And I'm going to move into some questions and answers, hopefully. I do want to acknowledge that there was an ability through the registration process for this webinar to submit questions. So I'm going to go kind of back and forth from what's been entered in the Q&A box to some of those other questions that were submitted during the registration process. So I'll start with this one because I think it's really a great question, and we touched on it a lot during the latter parts of the development of the toolkit, and it's really around evaluation. So the question is, how do you ensure that your funders and or high-ranking staff also get the results they want from their staff in a trauma-informed healing way? And I think what this might lend itself to is, okay, I have to get so many people employed in a month, or I have to meet work participation rates, or I have to, this person isn't maybe doing what is involved in their plan, and we have to move to the next level, maybe sanctioning benefits or something to that effect. So can you all maybe just address that in a minute or two around what you think that might look like?
Andrea, do you have thoughts?
Sure, I can start. I'm curious of your thoughts also, Mandy. I think that sort of going broad to specific, the question of impact and evaluation and making sure your funders are seeing what they want. I think that that's an unavoidable question. Wherever your funding is coming from is to how you're meeting those performance goals, and if trauma-informed care is folded into those, how does an agency think about sort of measuring those outcomes? The very last tool in the toolkit talks a little bit about sort of a framework for assessment or evaluation of programs, and is not prescriptive, but sort of takes this thought-based approach for agencies to think about. I loved it when Mandy said, trauma-informed care is all about engagement. If it's about engagement and about the families we're serving, well, then maybe some of the data needs to come from them. So that last toolkit sort of, has agencies think through how have you defined principles? What kinds of data are you collecting? Where do those data come from? And are you actually looking at those and then thinking about how to improve the program? So it is this cycle of sort of improvement. In terms of sort of the role of staff, again, I would, go back to sort of thinking about how we really support staff in this work. It is tiring work, and I think that opening those conversations up, one of the things we talked about at the all staff day is, switching even just some conversations between caseworkers and supervisors instead of supervisors. Well, if you ever have a problem, come to me. That places a lot of responsibility on the individual. When should I go? How do I go? Instead of sort of having more open office hours or supervisors checking in with their staff.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that I think sometimes that is the misconception of trauma-informed care, is that it's not structured and therefore things won't happen. Like work won't happen if we're trauma-informed because we're going to be talking, and that's the hard thing with the name of it. That if you apply trauma-informed care principles for staff and for those you serve, what we should be seeing is the work happening more efficiently, more effectively. And so the return on investment for doing trauma-informed care, which is a lot of the work I have to talk about, is that the work should be done kind of in the way that you're wanting it done. And I'm bouncing words around that because the reality is, first of all, the service should be effective in and of itself. Like, is the service, the original service you're offering, actually effective? Because if it's not, that's a different issue. Trauma-informed care is going to help you then. Like, if you believe if providing food in a certain way to people is effective, then again, if people aren't getting to the food, that's where trauma-informed care is going to help you, because maybe they don't feel safe coming to the school to pick up those meals. Maybe they don't, and that's going to then be your kind of metric of engagement. And what we find is and trauma-informed care, one of the things I do a lot of teaching about is that it's about being direct and informative. It is not about, people in chaos don't need a lot of like, it depends and we'll sees and I don't know. And it's either gets top down or it gets chaotic, and we need that in between. And knowing something about the brain helps us realize how we do supervision. How can we do supervision in a trauma-informed way? How can we develop a lobby in a trauma-informed way so people are moving through that with less toxic stress and just will be more effective in all that they do?
Thanks, Mandy. Nicole, this really comes down to the programmatic features and how you all, maybe you can talk about how you plan to address some of that or have addressed it already through the process.
Yeah, so I think we kind of touched on it a little bit, and, Mandy just talked about it too, that it's not necessarily that we are completely changing what we're doing. Like, we know things are effective. They could be more effective if they were done in a trauma-informed way. So like some of the examples we gave about going from an assessment to a tool, or getting rid of the orientation at like the point of entry. We're still doing those things. We're still using tools. We're still collecting information. We're still giving an orientation to the program and making sure that people have the information. We're just doing it at a point where they have the bandwidth to absorb it. So we're kind of making shifts like that. We're not completely getting rid of things. It's just making sure that at the point that we introduce something to the participant, it's at a point where they can absorb the information and it's actually helpful to them.
Great. So I'm going to go over to one of the questions. I'm getting some feedback. One of the questions from the participants real time here. Can you explain, and you just talked a little bit about this, Nicole, so maybe you can address it, how the relationship is developed before jumping maybe into program orientation or assessment? Are there steps or training that you've given staff to kind of move into that place?
So on the toolkit, we haven't done training yet, but we've definitely introduced a lot of, trauma-informed principles. Our staff has done countless trainings on that in different models and being strength-based and the strengthening families framework and whatnot. But I definitely think that being client-centered and goal-oriented has really helped to encourage developing that relationship before kind of diving into past trauma. So that's definitely something that we've focused on a lot. That the point of eligibility in the beginning when somebody is in kind of a desperate situation is really about like, what do we need to get them on the benefit? And then once they're introduced to who their case manager is going to be ongoing, developing that relationship and moving slowly into it. I think you're muted, Mary.
Yes, trying not to put that background noise. So how might TANF case managers take a human-centered engagement approach over the phone? So this is very relevant for today, and discuss sensitive topics, domestic violence, and so forth, that are more difficult for staff on the phone, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we within Reach Up have a lot of different referral pathways. So, we are connected with, so within our state, we have the network, and each network has a member program in a region, which is the Domestic Violence Agency. So we do a lot of soft handoffs, whether it be through video chat or even on the phone, referrals to people who are experts in that or can provide assistance. And talking to them that way. We've gone to a lot of FaceTime interactions, and we're also very conscious of what people have going on in their lives with having kids at home and perhaps having, abusers in the house while they're trying to have conversations like that with us. And so we definitely have those conversations with staff on a regular basis and encourage them to talk to each other about what worked. And even just yesterday, one of our mental health groups that we run in one of our counties was talking about just being able to have people connect, and a simple way to help with distraction for them would be to provide them with headphones. So that's what we're going to do. We work through it, and we're learning as we go, because none of us have ever been through a global pandemic before. So
Sure. Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that? We only have about 1 more minute.
I just want to sort of say that Mandy modeled some of that behavior or conversation when we started the webinar. I think a small sort of acknowledgement of the difficulties we're all facing right now goes a really long way in sort of setting the tone for a conversation.
The only quick thing I'll add is I do think sometimes the anxiety of that is more on us than the person receiving, that sometimes the phone actually feels really safe for some people. And so it's really kind of having that conversation up front about there are definitely some techniques around adding more time. You're going to need to give more words to things, right? That like this may land awkwardly because you can't see my face if you're doing it just on the phone. So I do think there's some strategies to use, but I also think sometimes it's us learning how to adapt to doing things differently is also the lift and the work that has to be done.
Great. Thank you, Mandy. Thanks to all of you. I'm gonna ask that we move to the next slide and kind of talk a little bit about PeerTA for a second, then I'll hand it over to James to kind of close us out. Again, thank you so much. I think this was a great discussion, and for those of you who didn't quite get to the toolkit or some of the resources or the PowerPoint, please know that we will be sending out those materials with the video of this webinar shortly after, within a few days. And for those of you that don't know about PeerTA, you can see that right on the screen, how you can request technical assistance through the PeerTA, OFA PeerTA network, how you can submit questions, find resources. It really is a great place to go for information. The toolkit is uploaded here. And as well as many other resources connected to trauma-informed care. So the website is right to your left, so you have this as a resource, and those of you that ask to sign up for the newsletter will make sure that you get on the list to get the great resources right in your email box periodically when you need them. So without, I think that's it for me. James, I'm going to hand it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Mary. I just want to take a couple of minutes to thank our presenters, Mandy, Nicole, and Andrea, for taking time out of your schedules to share with us today. And most importantly, as I always say, those of you who joined us for today's webinar. We hope that you've heard something that resonated with you and that maybe for your program, you maybe think, hey, this is something that I want to maybe reach out to PeerTA, and perhaps I can get some assistance by making a PeerTA request to implement something in my program. So again, as has been said several times already, if we were not able to respond to your question through the Q&A chat box, we will respond to those questions after the webinar, and that information will be posted on our PeerTA website within the coming days. If you have further questions or comments, please be sure to contact me or Mary Roberto, as was mentioned in the slide before you. And that's all that I have. I'd like to once again, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Stay safe and enjoy the remainder of your day.